we loved the film, Lynn. We were just comparing notes earlier about it, and I'm just going to get us started, and then we'll go around. But I'm Allison Inman. I'm the Education Engagement Director at the Belcourt. So nice to officially meet. I the thing that was so pleasing to me about this film, among other things, is the richness of the interiors that seem to match the story in such a way, like all of the personal effects that are on everybody's wall. And then now to see you and see that you have stuff all over your
Oh my
walls,
gosh.
it's so important in the film. It made me love the film so much. I felt ensconced in it, and I also have kind of a maximalist, tendency myself. I just like to feel surrounded. It makes me feel, it just makes me feel safe. And you must have grown up in that same way, and it must have rubbed off on you. And it seems so much like it mirrors your complex family story. I just wondered if you have any comments on that.
Well, Allison, nice to meet you. And I'd like to kind of respond to some of your very first words, which were to the notion of the group of you comparing notes. That's really interesting to me because I think it has to do with something I mentioned in the begin my introduction, which has to do with perception. So you could have shared notes about my family and about the people or the characters or how this family worked, but you also might have shared notes about how it is and isn't different from your own family, or how every family has one or two people in it that become a sort of part of a vortex, and everything else surrounds them. And it's not always the most obvious person. It's not necessarily the loudest person or the most powerful person or, the most vulnerable person. It just happens. And then everybody else kind of builds around that. So that was really interesting to me to think about. Like also notes are very active. There's not just conversation, but it's like a figure of speech. It's very responsive. It's about collecting things. And then that leads me to what you said about collecting. I actually made a couple of films in the 80s when I first started making films. And one of them was Still Life with Woman and Four Objects. And so I was always, like you, interested in the way that objects surround us, and they start to define who we are, and they mirror who we are, and they remind us of things. And so I think in this film, it's true that the three-dimensional, or a photograph, the way there's a lot of collage, like old-fashioned collages where people are cutting out, and you think about, well, in a collage, there's what's cut in and what's cut out. And what's kind of separated. And so for every object that's in your life, there's also the object, or like, I'm looking behind your head, I really like that empty frame. That's very moving to me, especially like the frame of the film. But you're sort of saying it's about framing. It's like that the verb, the to frame, is more important than what's in it or outside.
We definitely all had different notes about it based on our own lives and experiences. So I love that you said that. Yeah, somebody else, May.
Lynn, I would love for you to speak to how you've tethered your title, Film About a Woman Who, to Yvonne Rayner's film about a woman who, a film to which in interviews before you've expressed your admiration for, um, and maybe to give people a context for that film if they have not seen it. um, I would describe the film as unapologetically feminist. It tackled then traditional unraveling notions about a relatively privileged white woman, especially in relation to the messaging surrounding second wave feminism. And even how, when Yvonne, a participant in second wave feminism, she's at war with the discomfort of alienation, questioning relevance, vying for agency. Um, and I kind of experienced your film something as a reverse positive of Rayner's film, and that you're attempting to reckon with your father's ideas of manhood and his imposition of what I perceive to be chauvinism on women who, by their own admission, they didn't possess the privilege of participating as equals in his commitment to free love. So for me, he comes off more of a chauvinist rather than a hippie idealist. But could you speak to your tethering your film title to her film?
Um, Yvonne Rayner's been really important to me, and in the ways that she tried to address something that Allison talked about. She was talking about the interiority of a space, but also this notion of the interiority of the mind. And she actually made another film called Lives of Performers, where you're seeing these people moving through space. They're dancing together, but you also have the opportunity to enter their heads. And so I was really interested in the kind of grammar of that film and the ruptures that it placed on the gaze, and the kind of also the film is very austere. And I would say my film is quite different in that way. You know, it allows for different kinds of pleasures of the cinema. And I think that you kind of hit on something around another wave of feminism, if you called it the third or the fourth, which is to address masculinity. And that was really a big goal in my film. And it wasn't to say that all men are a certain way, but in a sense to look at men, for example, my brothers, like the sons of a man who, as you said, treats women poorly. Not all women, not all of his daughters, but some of, I mean, it's all very complicated. But I think men in our generation and even younger are trying to rediscover and rename masculinity instead of embracing, as you said, like a kind of like a privileging of being male. That there's that men can actually mirror women, and that was never done before. And I think that Yvonne Rader also plays with that, and in her characterization in Film About a Woman Who, and her film ends with an ellipsis, as in you're continuing it, you're filling it in a very active spectator's way. And I think in mine, I don't use the ellipsis, but I think I wanted that completion of the sentence or the clause to happen through the viewers, as well as all the people who are surrounding the sort of main character.
Yeah, and to speak to what you just said, I hope you don't feel that I'm just simplistically reducing your father to my perception of chauvinism, but just in there's a moment in Yvonne's film where she says, with an intertitle card juxtaposed over her, an image of her face, who is the victim? And very much we see that question being posed in your film when speaking to the man that was your grandfather, but we're not certain if it was his biological father, and his being left, and the emotions that perhaps informed his future behavior.
That's really an interesting interpretation, and I like that. And I think, you know, actually these days people are breaking down what is masculinity. It used to be like you're either a male chauvinist or you're not, and now there's shadings and there are ways of being male. And I think, you know, we need to have a men's liberation movement, a liberation from chauvinism, you know. And I think I've talked about this with my brothers too.
You recorded those conversations as well. I would love to hear that. Going back to what you are saying about the ellipses as to whether to use them in the title or not, I found myself as kind of coming back to the movie after I was mentioning to my coworkers that it's been about 2 or 3 months removed for me since I've viewed it. So I kind of had to do a little bit of scanning back through to refamiliarize myself earlier, and how we each bring our own experiences to a movie like yours is I find really interesting, because I have a father who couldn't be the perfect polar opposite of yours. So I think in a way that makes me relate to your film even more, because it's such a very different experience in a way from my own. But I'm thinking to myself, wow, if I made a movie about my father, how would I approach that myself? And I don't know. You look like you want to say something.
Well, I think that it excites me. And actually, I showed it to some friends of my dad's who are in their 80s. And I thought I might feel ashamed, or that it would open them up to a realization that they had all been in a college fraternity with him. And I thought they were going to all say, oh my God, we didn't know all of this about Ira. But instead they said, I wish my daughter made a movie about me, for whatever reason, whether you're, every human being has the possibility of being narrativized, and sometimes the best stories are the ones about people who are not necessarily the most accomplished,
Right.
And it seems like people are actually, even if a portrait of them is not, not in the most positive light, people still seem to appreciate being portrayed in film, don't you think?
I think so, for sure. Like actually today on social media, because the film's opening tomorrow, so people are kind of writing to my siblings and writing to me. And this one old friend of my sister's wrote, I've never met someone who was the star of a movie, and I met your dad. And she met him like 30 years ago, and she's like, whoa. And I got to tell him that he would like that. I wanted to say something else about Memphis, in the sense that I just feel like you're the right audience. So my father was born in Memphis. He had his children in Memphis, and he was there. He went to college in Florida, but mostly he was in Memphis. And then he decided he needed to go west. And it's interesting, and go all the way to Utah, because I think that might come through in like the landscape and the terrain of the film, or the objects, Allison, would say, because you have you literally have these mountains. And there's, I think, for my father, and he said this to us many times, that it's all been done in Memphis. It's all been built. There's nowhere to go through with your machete. Although we used to go camping on an island in the Mississippi River, and he did go through it with a machete, but there weren't many places to do that. And somehow he saw Utah then, at least in the 70s. Now a lot of it's very developed, but as this possibility for reinventing himself, and for being somebody different. And I think Maita, is that how you pronounce your name?
Oh, Meita. That's my abuelita, her pet name for me.
May. Okay, sorry. May. I think there was a way of going there, and once again, kind of having the call it privilege of just being whoever you wanted, and then not playing by the rules at all. Because the West, like, there are no rules, which is not really true, but it is a way of thinking. It's like a rhetoric of the West.
Yeah, and also speaking to that, I found it so interesting that he spent so much of his time at work, in that he's developing these spaces to kind of nurture the community, or to encourage a community. And I couldn't help but think how the family must feel when he's nurturing these developments, but maybe not spending as much time, developing community with his family.
Well, one of the themes I tried to explore in the film is kind of that irony that has to do with a lot of naturalists. So you really appreciate the trees, and you you you're awed by a view, but then you build a road to it and you excavate all the time. So you make it easy to get there. You frame it, you make it accessible, you make it comfortable. I mean, how many people go to places like Park City, Utah, yes, for the view, but also to have perfect heating in the winter and perfect air conditioning in the summer. And there's a kind of constant contradiction that has to do with taming. And so that was one of the reasons I wanted to play with that image of the mountain that's actually a quarry. So you look at the mountain and you're sort of awed by the lines of this craggy hill or mount, but you see it explode. And so in the film, you also hear my dad showing it and being very excited and kind of showing it to his children. But there's also this other side, which is that the natural landscape is being broken up and is very fragile, as we are, like you were talking, the way community and family, it's fragile. And what does it mean to nourish it?
I'm gonna let Zach jump in with a question here.
So one of the things for me, I guess, just to bring it back to sort of the beginning, when we were talking about comparing notes, this film feels like you and your siblings and the extended family are all comparing notes to sort of get to the root of some sort of truth. And for me, I'm an only child, and so I didn't really understand until I saw it in this movie that this is something that, siblings can do. They can sort of assemble a familial biography amongst themselves. And here, this film feels like you're sort of externalizing this familial biography and trying to fill in these gaps that are there. And it's totally fascinating to me. But one of the things that really stuck out to me is that you have all these interviews with your siblings, and you're all just sort of casually in the bedroom talking on the beds and stuff. And there's something so incredibly personal and interesting about that. And I'd be very curious just to hear what it's like to be a part of a family where that kind of honesty, but also these hidden truths lurking under the surface, and how you even walk that or tread that line as a filmmaker of making these very intimate moments public.
Yeah, well, I have never done it to that extent. And I made another film called The House of Science, where I actually took my clothes off and I wrote poems about all the effusions coming out of my body. But that could have been any woman, really. It had a kind of like any woman, every woman archetypal kind of thing. But I thought it was really raw, but this was a more raw film, because when it's your life specifically, the personal becomes revealed to a point. And I really was interested in your thoughts about assembling through with siblings, because even if you're cut from the same cloth, or half the same cloth, you still or can be very different. But you have maybe a trust that you won't betray each other. And so there's a kind of thought that you're working on something together. And a couple of my sisters I didn't know at all before, just a few years ago. And so by inviting them to speak to me, it made it possible for them to feel more intertwined and heard. And I didn't really understand that till even after I made the film. But, many of us have our thoughts, but we don't feel heard. And so a film like gives a frame, again, going back to Allison's idea, the film gives a framework, and it gives a place like an archive. Like they know that what they said is in my computer right here. So that is I think that is a way that any kind of collaborative project invites that kind of like participation, both physical and in psychological. But then you were talking about that bedroom scene where my brother Ira, my sister Dana, and I are sitting on a bed talking about grammar. I have to say that I thought I was directing that scene, and so I was basically in my pajamas. I did not realize I was going to be in it. My husband was shooting it. I just said, "Here, take the camera. Will you shoot us talking?" And then we started talking about grammar. My sister's a writer, and I'm very interested in grammar and the way grammar works as this scaffolding for a lot of different things. And I knew that in the film I had spoken about my dad's like kind of inventing his own language. So I said, even though it wasn't literally another language, but it was a way of being and like a discourse. So I said, let's just go with this idea around grammar. And, there were times when I was making the film where particularly my sister Dana said, but this is making us change. But you're always having a camera can be kind of stultifying or maybe even oppressive. And so there, about a year and maybe 2 years ago, she said, if you're going to film, you need to announce that you're going to film. You need to stand up and be sure that everybody knows. And in a sense, that was kind of like a announcement of permission. I think it had a lot to do with the digital age in which we live, where people are more cautious and protective of their identity. So I tried to do that as much as I could.
I was going to ask you about when the camera comes out, because I think it's hard to get interviews that are so natural, and it just, I just can't imagine that there's a camera in the room. It all feels so.
There's often not a camera, especially the last 2 years. I stopped doing a lot of camera filming, and I used almost all audio because people are too self-conscious about their appearance.
Oh,
I don't mean like looking pretty. I just mean like, am I eating, or was I late, or all those different things that an audio only interaction freed us all from. So I started doing audio only interviews. I call them interviews or just conversations with almost everyone in the film, sometimes in a closet, often in a closet, because I didn't want them to look back at me for validation. Like, oh yeah, all the stuff that all of us are doing right now, which you're making me feel, and I hope I'm doing the same for you. I'm saying, yes, I understand. But I didn't want them to see that, because I didn't want them to feel responsible for my understanding, because their experience would be different from mine.
wow. I also have to say how much the titles or the credits were just fit so well with the story. They were brilliant.
Well, doesn't that go back to the grammar a little bit? I mean, it looks like you
Okay.
basically
How many of you? Yes. So Toby, clearly you might be the only one. I don't know, Allison. Did you all do diagramming?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, me too. How many of you did diagramming?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, everybody. So you all knew. That's surprising. Maybe it is a Southern thing. I don't know. But I did diagramming and I actually grew to like it. And I like the idea of this dangling participle. And I, literally, and that's a funny, hilarious expression. And, the dependent clause and the independent clause and how they all support each other. And we were kind of talking about grammar in the film, and about my dad being a lot of exclamation marks, or back then we didn't do a lot of exclamation marks. One was enough. And then like my mom was a semicolon and a comma and just all those things. But I started to think about the fact that, as people are watching the film, they're also wondering about that thing called the family tree. So I could have had a family tree in the beginning of the film, but then you would have known where it was going. And it wasn't that important to me that you finish the film and you know the order of the children and you know all that. That's like absolutely not what I cared about. But I wanted to allude to it as being a scaffolding that is part of any family, but not part of you as viewer being completely comfortable, like with the knowledge. That wasn't the knowledge I needed you to walk away with. So that's what I wanted the titles to look like, a melding of diagramming and a family tree. And it just so happened that a woman I knew here, a very good friend of the woman who edited the film with me, went to Catholic school in Texas. She's only about 24, but they did diagramming. So when I said I wanted to look like diagramming, she knew.
She did an amazing job.
Didn't she do a good
Yes.
job?
Yes. Well, we've had you pass the time that I said we would. So I guess we can wrap it up. But I so appreciate getting to talk to you. I know we all do. Yeah, this is my dog Cherry. But thanks for taking the time. And
Oh, thanks for bringing my movie home.
yeah,
You know, it's very, very important to me, and I just gives me a thrill, and I hope it goes well.
thank you. And yeah, hopefully when your next film comes out, it'll be back to real life and you can come see us in person.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
If I can say one more thing to
Sure.
you that I so appreciate as a woman, a Mexican American woman, I really appreciate when you're discussing your films, how attentive you are to your awareness of yourself in relation to the people that are collaborating with you in front of your camera. I really appreciate that.
Oh, that is a really, really meaningful thing for me to hear from you. Yeah, I don't like to use words like crew and cast at all. I feel really uncomfortable, but I even feel really uncomfortable with the word director. I like to say filmmaker, and I just think we work in these collective ways. And so thank you very much for acknowledging that.
Thanks, Lynn.
Thanks, Lynn. Bye.
And
See you guys.
bye.